found them at dawn. Bodies slumped against cold stone walls, faces locked in grotesque masks of agony. Some still twitched, their feet jerking as if the dance had not ended, even in death. The streets of Strasbourg reeked of sweat, blood, and something heavier, an invisible sickness that clung to the air. The city had torn itself apart without a single sword raised. No war, no enemy army, only its own people, and a rhythm that would not let them go. Witnesses swore the sound had started weeks before. Not music, not celebration, but the pounding of souls against cobblestone. One heartbeat, multiplied by hundreds, until it became a drumbeat of death. No priest could explain it. No healer could stop it. Men and women danced until their feet split open, until their chests collapsed, until the light left their eyes. And yet, more joined them. It did not begin with a festival. It began with a single woman, stepping into the street, moving to a tune no one else could hear. And that was when Strasbourg's summer turned into a month of madness. She did not come with banners, nor with music. She came alone. On a hot July morning in 1518, Frau Troffea stepped out from the narrow doorway of her home in Strasbourg. Her neighbors saw her pause in the middle of the street, bare feet on warm stone, hands hanging limp at her sides. She looked ordinary, until she began to move. It was not a noble's dance nor the swaying of a peasant's celebration. Her feet struck the ground in quick, sharp bursts, over and over, the sound echoing down the empty lane. Her eyes were open, but they seemed to be looking through the world around her. Hours passed. She did not stop to drink, to rest, or to speak. By the time the sun began to sink, a small crowd had gathered. Some whispered that she was cursed. Others thought she was mocking the church. No one dared touch her, as if one brush of the hand might pass the madness along. The next day, she returned, still moving, still silent. Her body shuddered with exhaustion, yet her steps did not falter. Children peeked from behind market stalls. Merchants leaned in doorways, muttering about evil spirits. And then, on the third day, something happened. A man stepped forward and began to dance beside her, not with joy, but with the same grim, relentless rhythm. Then another joined, and another. What began as one woman's strange affliction was about to spill into the veins of the entire city. It began as a murmur in the streets, and then it became a roar. By the seventh day, Frau Troffea was no longer alone. The narrow lane where she had first stamped her bare feet had swelled into a human tide. Men with sweat-soaked shirts clinging to their backs, women with hair loose and eyes vacant, even boys barely into their teens. They moved in jagged unison, like puppets pulled by unseen strings. The sound was unbearable. Dozens of souls slamming stone in uneven syncopation, a pounding that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It rattled shutters. It shook the nerves of everyone within earshot. Market sellers abandoned their stalls, unable to hear their own voices over the relentless beat. From the cathedral steps, a cluster of priests watched in silence. Some crossed themselves. Others whispered prayers too fast to catch. The bishop's envoy had already sent riders to consult healers in neighboring towns. Rumors clung to the air like smoke, whispers of a curse from Saint Vitus, of demons that had slipped into the city under cover of summer heat. of ergot-poisoned bread that drove the mind into frenzy. But even those who feared the devil could not explain why so many danced with such grim devotion. In the side streets, old women pressed themselves into doorways, peering out from behind hanging laundry. They swore they recognized faces: bakers, coopers, merchants' wives, people they'd seen that morning buying bread, now grinding their heels into the dust as if their very lives depended on each step. By midday, the fever had spread to the marketplace. A cloth seller from the outskirts dropped his bundles mid-sale and began to sway, then stomp, then spin in the same strange rhythm. Within minutes, 4 others had joined him. Their movements were awkward at first, like drunkards, but soon they matched the pace exactly, as if some invisible drum had found them. Children were the hardest to watch. Small feet smacking the cobbles until their skin split. Yet their faces remained frozen between laughter and sobbing. A mother tried to drag her daughter away. The girl wrenched free and plunged back into the churning mass. The woman screamed her name until her voice cracked. By nightfall, the square was a living machine, arms jerking, heads snapping, feet pounding. Torches cast wild shadows across the faces, making them look less than human. And somewhere in the crowd, Frau Troffea still moved, her pace unbroken, her eyes reflecting nothing. The city had stopped asking why. Now they wondered only how far this would go, and who would survive it. But the body has limits, and soon those limits would break. The human body is not built for war against itself. By the second week, the dancers' faces had turned a waxy gray, lips cracked and bleeding. Their clothes clung to them, stiff with dried sweat and dust. Every step drove fresh pain up their legs, but their feet kept finding the ground. It was as if their own muscles were deaf to their screams. Those who collapsed were dragged to the side by family or strangers, but many of them rose again within minutes, staggering back into the chaos with the stubborn will of the damned. Some clutched their chests mid-step, gasping, yet their legs moved on without mercy. A few were seen laughing, high, thin sounds that broke suddenly into coughing fits. Healers tried to force water between clenched teeth. Some poured cool wine on the dancers' heads, hoping to shock them into stopping. Nothing worked. One physician swore he saw a man's ankle snap with a sound like dry wood, and yet the man spun, dragging the broken limb like dead weight. In the evenings, the smell was unbearable. Blood from torn souls mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies, turning the summer air sour. Dogs circled the edges of the square, whining, tails low. A merchant returning from the river covered his face with his cloak, unable to breathe. This was no longer a spectacle. It was a slow execution. The toll began to rise. A boy no older than 15 dropped mid-step, his body convulsing before lying still. An elderly woman was found slumped against a cart, head bowed, feet still twitching faintly as the light faded from her eyes. Some were carried away under sheets. Others were left where they fell until night covered them. And yet, at dawn, the pounding began again. Even the dead seemed to leave an echo behind, a rhythm that others picked up without knowing why. It was as though the ground itself remembered their steps and demanded more. But while the city drowned in exhaustion and fear, the church had found its answer, an answer that would lead them into darker territory still. Faith can comfort the fearful, or bind them tighter to the fear. By mid-July, the city's priests declared the cause clear. This was no sickness of the flesh. It was a curse laid by Saint Vitus, the patron of dancers and convulsions, upon those who had offended him. Some whispered it was punishment for swearing oaths falsely, for mocking the relics in the cathedral, for sins left unconfessed. The sermons grew heavier, words echoing in the vaulted nave like hammer blows. The faithful were told that the only hope was to appease the saint, to surrender the afflicted to his will. In the square, these whispers became chains. Even those who doubted the curse dared not say it aloud, for fear they too would be seized by the rhythm. In darkened confessionals, the stories came pouring out. Merchants admitted to cheating scales, wives to bitter grudges, men to secret blasphemies muttered in drink. Each confession fed the belief that this was not a plague, it was a judgment. The church organized processions. A line of dancers, some still moving, others barely able to stand, was led through the streets to a small shrine at the city's edge. There, relics of Saint Vitus were held aloft, glinting in the torchlight. Priests anointed foreheads with holy water, chanting prayers meant to sever the saint's grip. But the sight was not one of peace. Some collapsed before reaching the shrine. Others screamed as the water touched them, thrashing harder than before, as if the blessing had become a spur. The line between miracle and torment blurred until no one could tell which was which. By the month's third week, the clergy's certainty had turned desperate. They began to wonder if the cure might not be prayer alone, but something far more drastic. Power can command soldiers, but it cannot command madness. By late July, the city council had grown restless. The priests' processions had failed. The prayers had failed. Every morning, the square still filled with the same pounding, the same wild faces, the same collapsing bodies. And so the magistrates made a decision that would seal Strasbourg's fate. They believed the only way to end the dance was to let it run its course. Musicians were summoned from across the region, drummers, pipers, fiddlers, and paid to play from dawn until dusk. A raised platform was built in the square. The idea was simple: give the dancers music, give them space, let them exhaust themselves to the point of collapse. It was the kind of logic that sounds merciful until you see it in motion. On the first day of music, the crowd doubled. The steady beat of the drums merged with the stamping of feet, forming a single, suffocating rhythm that gripped even the onlookers. Some who had resisted for weeks now found themselves pulled forward, swaying, stepping, until they were swallowed by the mass. Merchants complained that no one came to buy. The entire city's commerce bled away into the square. Beggars abandoned their corners to join the throng, their ragged clothes whipping in the air as they spun. Fights broke out among the musicians over tempo, some wanting to slow the pace to save lives, others speeding it up to force the end. And through it all, the dancers' bodies began to break. Knees buckled and would not straighten. Blood slicked the stones where bare feet had worn the skin away. A woman fainted mid-turn, hitting her head on the stage. She was carried out limp, her dress soaked crimson. Still, the music did not stop. What the council had unleashed was not a cure. It was a furnace burning the city's strength to ash. And as the weeks dragged on, the sound in the square no longer resembled music at all, only the pounding of death's own march. There are months the living remember, and months the living try to forget. August bled into Strasbourg like a fever. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with the mingled stench of sweat, dust, and the iron tang of blood. Every morning, before the sun even cleared the rooftops, The square came alive with the same terrible rhythm, the pounding of feet that had long since forgotten rest. By now, some dancers moved as if in a dream, their eyes unfocused, faces slack. Others twitched violently with every step, as though their bodies were rejecting their own movements, but had lost the power to stop. It was no longer a dance. It was a convulsion given form. At the edges of the square, the ground had been stained a deep brown from dried blood. Flies swarmed over torn soles and open wounds. The moans of the exhausted mixed with the relentless beat, a sound that seemed to shake the very air. Merchants spoke of sleepless nights, of waking to the phantom sound of drums even when the music had stopped. Those who still had strength dragged the dead to side streets, covering them with cloth before the sun made them reek. But the number grew too fast. Before long, bodies were left in the shadows of the cathedral until they could be carted away at night. The line between the holy ground and the charnel ground vanished in those weeks. A child's body was found curled against the base of a statue of the Virgin, her small feet still bare and dusted with blood. An old man died mid-step, collapsing in such a way that the dancers simply moved around him, never breaking pace. Some claimed to see faces in the windows above, gaunt and pale, watching the madness below with silent dread, afraid that even looking too long might pull them into the square. The council stopped sending musicians. The clergy stopped their processions. The city had retreated into survival, waiting for the storm to burn itself out. But the storm had one last act to play, and it would lead them beyond the city walls. Salvation, when it finally came, looked nothing like mercy. By the end of August, the council and clergy agreed on one last attempt. The dancers who still breathed, the ones whose legs had not yet given way entirely, were to be taken from the city to a shrine of Saint Vitus in the hills. It was said that there, in the saint's shadow, his curse could be lifted. They were herded at dawn, some supported between two men, others stumbling forward on their own, still stamping and jerking with every step. The road out of Strasbourg wound through fields already turning for harvest, but there was no peace in the journey. The rhythm clung to them like a ghost, their feet drumming a path into the dust. Every mile was a reminder that whatever gripped them had not loosened its hold. Villagers along the way crossed themselves and turned away, bolting doors and shuttering windows. The procession looked less like a pilgrimage and more like a chain gang from some forgotten war. Some fell before reaching the shrine, lying motionless by the roadside, their faces turned toward the sky as if asking for an answer that never came. At the foot of the shrine, the priests began their work. Holy water splashed over bowed heads, relics were pressed against trembling foreheads, and psalms rose into the warm air. Some collapsed into stillness after the ritual, their bodies slack, as though the strings had been cut. Others wailed, their movements growing even more frantic, until they were restrained by force. No one agreed on which outcome was the cure. For the families, it was enough that the square fell silent at last. For those who had walked the road, the silence was not relief. It was the hollow space left behind when the music stopped. And yet, even as the city began to breathe again, whispers spread of dancers seen in distant villages, moving to a rhythm no one else could hear. Strasbourg returned to its work, to its markets, to the rhythm of ordinary life. The square that had once thundered with 100 feet now lay quiet, the stones washed clean, the air lighter. But for those who had lived through it, The silence was not victory. It was a shadow. They had seen neighbors, friends, even family vanish into the dance and return changed, or not at all. The city gained back its streets, but it lost a part of its certainty. The belief that life could be controlled, that faith and reason could explain every madness. Before the summer of 1518, they thought they understood the limits of the human body. After it, they began to fear the human mind. Maybe that is the truest cost. Not the lives ended, but the knowledge that something in us can rise without warning and take everything. If you've been drawn into this tale, consider subscribing to the channel, liking this video, sharing it, or leaving a comment. Your voice here helps keep these histories alive. And if you wish to step deeper into the shadows of the past, explore more stories in the playlist. Royal Blood and Tortures, the dark medieval tales. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, remember, history never truly sleeps.